Welcome to AgriView with me, Wandile. We have a lot to talk about this week. I'm just looking at my list here. Did you know that in Japan, the agricultural minister, Taku Ito, got fired for rice? Rice can get you fired, folks. It's a career hazard. Don't say I didn't warn you. Also, did you know that in South Africa, as we are going out there in the world promoting the agricultural exports, we just banned the imports of Brazilian poultry into the country. And I think we have to talk about that to say, what is that all about? Is it protectionism, a theme of the day, or is there really a serious issue that we have to consider? I also have to talk about the biosecurity matters. And I know biosecurity, too scientific, but it's very important. And in fact, you could argue that biosecurity is everything in agriculture. We have to talk about what's going on north of our border in South Africa. Zambia, they had an excellent grain harvest. You remember last year, it was tough over there. Now they have some good news that I think are worth reflecting about. Here at home, we have a number of things. Our big, beautiful grain harvest is one of the themes that we have to talk about. Starting off in Japan, rice can get you fired, folks. And that's what Mr. Taku Ito learned in a difficult way about a few weeks ago. He was the agricultural minister in Japan. And now there's context in all of this with the jokes aside. Japan has been struggling with a bit of a higher food price inflation. And the difficulty is that they've had a bad agricultural season, particularly in their staple grain, rice. And the agricultural minister, amongst many things that he said, he presented a bad joke in a tough season. He said, look, I didn't have to buy rice or even think about it because my supporters give me too much rice. Now, in an excellent season of abundance, that joke would have gone unnoticed. But this time around, the Japanese said, look, you're not going to joke around while we are struggling with food. And I think that's something that in the African continent we have to think about on people's portfolios and what they get to do and what they get to talk about. Now, we didn't look into rice just because of Japan. Of course, I'm sitting here in South Africa. Rice is important to us, although we grow 0% of rice. I mean, South Africa, we sit around and boast about how we are the only African country in the top 40 global agricultural exporters. But we also import a lot. And when it comes to rice, we import 100% of it. That's just over 1 million tons of rice. It's for ourselves, but also the African continent, especially the southern Africa. That's where we re-export some of the rice to. And now we were looking at this and I was like, if then Japan, where it's a staple crop, they are struggling with this, is there a problem with rice in the world? And fortunately, there is no problem with rice in the world. And in fact, the rice production in the world is now at a really super higher level. It's up from the previous season, with the world expecting to harvest around 541 million tons of rice. The stocks are also up at close to 180 million tons of rice that is there in the world, which means then that global rice prices are really coming down nicely, which of course, as a South African, where we buy all of the rice that we consume from the world market, we look into these things. But of course, if you are in Japan, where you are used to having rice more affordable than now, you would have learned not to make that joke. And you know what? We're not going to blame the Japanese because can you imagine in South Africa, we are in a tough drought season and you have the agricultural minister making jokes about the drought? Of course, we would have reacted the same. We are as strict as Japan when it comes to governance. Now, moving on swiftly to get to South America. You've just learned in the news that South Africa has actually banned the imports of poultry from Brazil. What is that about? Is South Africa going along the world and telling everybody to buy its products and not importing anything to the country? That is no. We import a lot from the world. And in fact, you know what? We usually talk about how the African continent spends almost about $80 billion importing food products annually. And the sub-Saharan Africa region spends to a range of around $45 to $50 billion of that $80 billion that we import food from the world about. Now, you may ask and say, who's importing this food? Is it all of these sub-Saharan Africa countries that are not as abundant as South Africa? And you will be surprised to learn that almost 8 to 10% of those imports are actually by South Africa. Yes, South Africa. We spend about $7 billion importing agricultural products in the country. But it's not a lot of stuff, folks, to be fair. We're importing a few things. It is palm oil, poultry, rice, and of course, whiskies. Yes, whiskies. We spend almost close to $500 million importing whiskey. I know you're looking at me. You're the ones who are consuming whiskey, not me. I'm just great to be enjoying the South African awesome wine. Now, on this poultry story that we're importing, as a country, the reality is that we are not producing sufficient poultry products for our own consumption. And yes, we have room where we can increase our domestic production, and that's what we want, so that we can fill in the gap, but also export to some of the neighboring countries. But the reality is that today we are spending roughly 370,000 tons of the poultry that is imported in a country, and of course spending a lot of money on bringing that in. Now, if you may ask me and say, in that 370,000 tons of poultry that come into the country, who's supplying that? And of course, it's different pieces that are there, but about 70% of those imports come from Brazil. And then you have the United States, Argentina, the EU, and the others are part and parcel of those suppliers. Now, if Brazil, we just banned their poultry imports, what is that about? Are we being protectionist? What is the story? But the story is actually really scientific. It has nothing to do with politics. And it's important that I raise this because we are in a world now where it's tariff. There's tariff man, tariff this side, and we need to make sure that whatever protectionism or whatever imports restriction happen, we clarify. This is a scientific matter. Brazil has an outbreak of what we call avian influenza, and we are just making sure that we restrict their imports temporarily, not throughout for a longer period. And the reason for that is that we remember our own challenges. I mean, folks, think about it. Just a few years back, in 2023, you were all seeing notices of egg prices going up, and people were saying you can be hijacked coming from the store. And folks will come in and say, do you have eggs in that bag? And if you have a cell phone, they will leave you and looking for eggs. That's what now we are fearing. At the time in South Africa where we were having those challenges, we had an avian influenza. We had to slaughter a lot of chickens, and now we couldn't produce enough. Even on the egg laying side, we had some difficulties. Now we want to protect ourselves against such issues. But of course, the discussion is nuanced, and it will be decided by scientists, because we know that some in South Africa have said, look, Brazil is having this challenge just in one region. You don't have to ban the whole country. Maybe regionalize and close that region and import from other countries. That may be a fair question, and that might be a fair point, given that as a country, we do need a bit of imports to keep food price inflation pretty much contained. And the fact that in the near term, the gap is there on the imports. But look, this is not only to make a case for the chicken importers or the Brazilians. It's the same argument that we are making. Because remember, as South Africa, in all of our efforts to say we want to increase the exports, we have some difficulties and we have to deal with animal diseases. It's the avian influenza that I was telling you about in 2023. But over those years, we struggled with other diseases, African swine fever in the pork industry, as well as the foot and mouth disease in the cattle industry. And in fact, today, we actually have a problem in our livestock industry, which is the foot and mouth disease. And this foot and mouth disease, though, we've had many countries, China included, saying, look, we're not going to import from South Africa, at least for now, until they sort out the foot and mouth disease. But the problem is the foot and mouth disease is not all over South Africa. It's a few areas in KZN, a few areas in the Eastern Cape, a few farms in Gauteng. Then why don't we regionalize also the areas that are affected? Then if you are in an area that is clean, you continue with the exports. And I think that's the point that the Brazilians and the importers are making. And as South Africa, we have to think about that. But that's not for all of us who are policy talking heads. That is a decision of scientists. They have to measure the risk and see how safe things are and what's the scale at which the diseases could be transferred, as well as look up for their own domestic consumers and their safety and everything else. Upon that, which they advise then the policymakers, and the policymakers get to make that decision. And I think let's leave the scientists to make that, and they will tell us, and we will see how we move along right that. That's the story of the poultry, and that's the story in South Africa. But in the South African side, it doesn't end there. We do need to invest a lot in biosecurity. By biosecurity, by the way, folks, I'm not just talking about animal health, I'm talking about plant health as well. We have to put money, because the reality is, with climate change, and these extreme weather conditions, more and more, we are beginning to see a higher outbreaks of these diseases. Of course, I'm not a scientist. They'll say, this guy is saying the climate change caused animal diseases. No, what I'm saying is we are observing more and more higher outbreaks across the country in a faster pace than we've seen a while ago. And therefore, if as a country we are in this journey where we say we want to export more to the world, especially in red meat, we may have to think about investing more in animal health. Now, as South Africa, this is not something new. We had put a lot of money to the OBPs, ARC, that's the Agricultural Research Council, and many others. The question then today is about how do we ensure that they revitalize all of the resources that they had, work with the private sector, and ensure that we can produce vaccines and we can move at a faster pace in controlling and surveillance of diseases. This is important. Not only just for the established farmers that are thinking about exporting, but the emerging and the new entrance farmers that are thinking about getting into the sector. Because if there are higher disease occurrences, those that have established feedlots will say, no, I'm not going to be buying cattle from random people everywhere. What if they bring diseases here and now my whole stock is affected? And that's the real concern. It's not that they are blocking the market and keeping it to the big man. No, it's because they are afraid of some serious diseases and they participate in the world market. The only way to ease up their jobs is to ensure that we invest in this. And it's not just the scientific part, but also human capital, education. These are all the things that as a country we have to think about. But now, enough about the problems. There is something that we have to celebrate. And in South Africa, we can celebrate, but let's start with our friends in Zambia, because you know what? Zambia is one of those countries that struggled with a heavy drought last year. It was so bad that the president of the country went on to television and said, look, we are declaring a national disaster in this country because of the drought. And he was sad, because Zambia is one of the anchors when it comes to maize supplies in Southern Africa, alongside South Africa in making sure that when there are challenges, South Africa exports, Zambia anchors in some regions. Now, when you had Zambia losing 50% of their crop, but it wasn't only that. Zimbabwe lost 60% of their crop, and we were hit by the midsummer drought in February last year. Now, this year started excellently. Great rains across the country, and I think now we are seeing a recovery. Just a few days ago, the Zambian president came out and said, look, our grain harvest is up 146%. They are expecting about 3.7 million tons of grain, which is way above what they need for themselves, which is 2.8 million tons of grain. So they have enough to export to the world. So we're really happy for Zambia, and Zimbabwe and the others are also seeing a recovery. Last point though, here at home, we also have some good news. We have a big, beautiful grain harvest that we are expecting in South Africa. And of course, if you think about our grain production, we are up also double digits. We are expecting just around about 18 million tons of grain. That is up 16% from last year. This means then that in South Africa, in soybeans, in maize, in a number of grains, will remain the net exporters. But it also means that when it comes to food price inflation, we can actually go for some time with reasonably contained food price inflation, higher grain harvest, to a certain extent, lower prices. This is good for human consumption, but also good for those that are in poultry and the livestock industry, because they use soybeans and yellow maize for their feed. And I think this is a good year. And with that, folks, I think it's important that we end it there before I mess up your day with more bad news. But for that, let's watch out for next week. Thank you for listening, and do subscribe to all of our channel and the YouTube channel, and follow us and spread the word. AgriView with me, Wandile.